So we're trying to get down this history, and we did the Maccabean uprising and basically the Roman Civil War that was involved to some extent in the various Roman conquests of Palestine. And then, in fact, the rise of the Herodian family, which is very important for the New Testament. You know, all the New Testament episodes, if you're familiar with the various presentations, make it clear that Jesus' birth has something to do with one of the Herods, you know, either, or another version of the birth that another version of the birth is that one of the emperors is doing a census. So it has both to do with the Roman Empire on the one hand in Luke, and in Matthew, the other story of his birth, Herod wanting to kill all the Jewish children or some such idea of that kind. Not documented, by the way, in Josephus. So it's good to know who these people were and who the Pharisees to some extent were and how these groups came into existence and so on. So after the fallout around, when was the first Roman conquest of Jerusalem? Did you get that out of your notes? 63 BC. Pretty close.
66.
Yeah, 63. That's the, you're thinking of 66 as the war against Rome. 63 BC is when Pompey, or Pompey as he's I think pronounced actually in Latin, stormed Jerusalem. And Pompey, as you may recall, was one of Caesar's triumvirs, the triumvirate. Caesar, Pompey, and Caesar at the west, Pompey the east, and someone in the middle. Lepidus, I think his name was. That would be the 70-60 BC period, and Pompey took Jerusalem. Now, in that process, Herod's family began to rise. Because the intermediary in the process of bringing the Roman troops into the country, something like Ahmad Shalabi today, helping to bring American troops, if you're familiar with the whole story, into Iraq. Bringing the Roman troops, I think they probably would have come anyway, but Herod's father, whose name I think was Antipater, I recall. Maybe the wrong, I think that's right. Herod's father was the instrumental sort of intermediary. If any of these things work. No sense keeping these things if they don't work. Took that in the basket and get a chance. Man, how about that one? That looks good. I don't think anything probably worked anyway. Antipater was the man who was the intermediary. Now, Eusebius will give his origins here. And if you've been reading Eusebius, he claims that Herod and his father were what origin? Greek and Arab, Greco-Arabs. This is not a Hebrew family. And that's what is missed by everybody who does the history of this period, and it's the first thing that undermines the presentation of the Gospels. Because Herod is being portrayed as a representative Jewish king, as you all know, even I'm sure in the Mel Gibson movie, which I will not see on principle. But the point is that only if I wanted to learn how to exploit the public would I see that movie, and I might want to see it for that reason, because it's always good to learn how to exploit the religious beliefs of the public and to make them more lurid than they actually are. But even if you got inspiration from that movie, it's something that I really feel is, knowing the historical format of what he's doing there is not watchable or a serious student. It is maybe watchable for someone who wants religious ecstasy or excitement. And it's not what I'm at. You may be, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong. That's what makes democracy. Anyway, to go back to the issue of Herod, that is the most serious flaw of people's knowledge of this period. Herod is presented as a basically, I would say, paradigmatic Jewish king. That he's a Jew and he's a king of the Jews, and in some sense he's rightfully there, and his family is rightfully there, and maybe now people don't love him or his family, but he's representative of Jewish interests and so on, and therefore things that he does wrong can be blamed on Jews. Well, it's just total, that's right from the start, total preposterous. You know, it's just like idiot history. People who don't do history and don't know history and are only interested in superficial approaches. Right from the get-go, Herod is a Greco-Arab. His family is Greco-Arab. If they are Judaized at all, and that's open to question, it's a superficial, surface sort of Judaization in order to ingratiate themselves to some extent, which they never succeeded in doing, with the population under whom or over which they were put in control. Now, how did they get control? They parlayed a Roman governorship into a dynasty. In other words, they were Roman civil servants. How did they get to be Roman civil servants? By the services rendered here that we're witnessing here now, of bringing the Roman army and facilitating its entrance into the country. Is that clear? I mean, that makes sense to you? So Herod's father, and Josephus makes it clear also. Herod's father, with contacts both on the Greek coast and more inland on the other side of the Jordan River. I think we could draw a map here if this thing works. It is working. Okay, so they came from here. We know where Gaza is. They came from around Gaza. Present day, we know what's going on there. It's the center of hassles even today. Jerusalem is up here. So this coastline was pretty Hellenized, Grecified. The main Jewish Hebrew concentration of population were there. It always had been. Funny, the thing is totally reversed now. That's where the Palestinians are to some extent, and the Jews are on the coastline. So it's totally inverted to some extent. In any event, over here is a place called Petra. I have this map in my chamber. How many have heard of Petra? Anyone can tell me what Petra is or was?
Great city in Jordan.
Yeah, the city rose red as old as time. Anyway, it was in a ravine where which had been cut out by water flow, a kind of canyon ravine, so that camel caravans could go in there and get good protection while they laid over on their journeys going north or south, because the caravan routes went down into Arabia for not just the spice trade from India, because the Red Sea was notoriously dangerous for pirates and things, and the currents were pretty bad as well for navigation. So some trade was done by sea, but a lot was done by camel caravan. But what were they? There was some trade from the spice, which mainly would have come from India to southern Arabia and then brought up. But what was the main thing they were going to southern Arabia to get? What's in the Bible? Frankincense. There were special trees, like we have redwood trees here in California that don't grow anywhere else. Special trees because of the odd climate of the monsoons coming in from Africa, hitting the mountains of southern Arabia and dropping rain there in this odd sort of configuration periodically every year, that there were trees that gave resin that was sweet smell. And I guess we call them aromatic resins. Myrrh, frankincense, these things are all resins from southern Arabian trees. And they were in particular demand in the Roman Empire because the place stunk because of outdoor sewage, the concentration of population, everybody, everything smelled. Even in churches today, you always get them as a relic of the past, going around and, waving these censers to put aromatics into the air to try to sweeten the smell of a public building. Or, for instance, in the hippie generation, everyone was burning incense to get rid of the marijuana odor or whatever, but they were burning incense. I don't know to me the odor of the incense was worse than the other odors, but in any case, people like incense. The Romans were addicted to these smelling improvement products. So that's what the trade was all about, and that's pictured a little bit in the Gospels, the birth of Christ, the tradesmen coming. But where they hang out, on this trade they hung out here, and that also was the east-west trade and the north-south trade. This was like a stop. This became very wealthy, and in time, this became known as Arabs. These people here, and an Arab king. Now, it turns out that Herod's father had connections there, and he married a woman from there. And apparently the story in Eusebius is that he was kidnapped. He was the son of a priest in the temple of Apollo here, and he was kidnapped and taken over there and grew up there and made good connections. So he had Greco-Arab connections. In other words, he was well connected. That's terribly important when you look at the picture of King Herod against Jesus. See, we think of it as the Jews being blue meanies, but nothing to do with the Jews being blue meanies at all. The Jews hated Herod, hated the Herodian dynasty, struggled for 200 years to get rid of it, or maybe a little less than that. Struggled constantly. Charismatic leaders like John the Baptist lost their life in that process. And this is totally unappreciated by the public at large because of the agenda of the people who constructed the documents that we hold sacred. You say, well, what are you trying to do? Undermine our documents? No, I'm trying to get rid of the agenda. Because you can't do history if there's an agenda out there. And the agenda out there is, unfortunately, anti-Semitism. The reason being that it's written mostly by Greeks, for Greeks, at a time when the Jews were in bad odor in the Roman Empire because they were unruly, obstreperous, and refused to surrender and give in. So the whole thing is to portray them as the negative people who are causing all the trouble. They may or may not have been. Messianic movement certainly was troublesome, like the Ayatollah is, rather not the Ayatollah, bin Laden is today. It was a subversive underground movement that was threatening the Roman Empire. The Romans were in every way intent on trying to suppress, because it was a movement, as we saw in time, that would not give in and was capable of taking new forms, mutating into new forms. One of the new forms is the religion that we are all familiar with, Christianity. Whether that's the original form in Palestine is what we're going to have to discover in this class. And of course, I've already told you I don't believe it was. I think that's the overseas form that was a mutation that developed in a later period. So to make it Palestinian, it's retrospectively portrayed in the documents we have as part of the doctrines of a Palestinian leader possibly killed by Jews. That's a very complicated thought, and it may be right away dismissed, but before you dismiss anything, let's just stick to the past, period. At least that gives you some groundwork to think about what we're talking about. We know we have a Messianic movement, and now we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are like a time capsule. That's why they're so important. See, we couldn't know any of the things that I talk about now without knowing about the Dead Sea Scrolls, because I now finally have a control. a native Palestinian literature that did not go through the editorial processes of the Roman Empire. That's a huge thing, and a massive literature to boot from approximately this period, which is also messianic. So we've got a control now that we never had before. And the more I personally work on it, the more I find it useful to be able to apply that to our documents, not always with a salutary effect. But now you say, I don't agree with anything you're saying. We can't not agree with what I'm saying without knowing the literature. If you study all the literature and know the ramifications and read all of Josephus and read all the Dead Sea Scrolls and read all the Gospels and read all Paul's letters and read all early church literature, then you can disagree. But you can't disagree on the basis of not wishing to look objectively at data. You can't disagree because you don't want to disagree. Oh, yes, you can. But when you have the equal data and more, hopefully, not just faith, which is not a quantity that we actually feel is good in an engineering department, because we don't want that those minute tolerances to be based on faith. We want those minute tolerances to be based on precision. You wouldn't take off in a 747 or something when I said that the metal stress fatigue had been measured on faith. You wouldn't step in that airplane. You wouldn't want to. You wouldn't risk your life. And so, you want those engineers to be totally precise. And that's what we want in a university. We want precision. If faith is precise, fair enough. If it isn't, then we have to, put it aside in order to get something more precise. One last point I want to make sure I lose the thought. Recently, they had one of those shuttle things crashed. Everyone was killed. Some nice people on that aircraft. And it turned out that there were some little problems of the heat shield, the tiles or something that hadn't been checked properly, and so on and so forth and so on and so forth. And that caused total disintegration of this vehicle. And so those things, everything has to be so precise in these worlds. Well, we're in the same university campus as those people. We can't have a chip for your computer that's malfunctioning. You're going to have a crash in your computer. No one's going to tolerate that. And no one, just in the field we're in, people tolerate anything, but it shouldn't be. Yeah, what's your point?
I was just wondering about Herod, the father.
Yeah, I'll get back there. I'm not back there. I want to finish my aside, and I'm going to get back there. I'll get you in a minute. So as far as why it's so important, what we were talking about, to know this little bit of information and why that has been transformed. Because, for instance, we get Herod, king of the Jews, looking to kill Jesus. So right away, someone's sensibilities, look, the Jewish king wants to kill Jesus. Baby Jesus is trying to be killed by the Jewish king. So immediately your sensibilities are affected. Oh, negatively. Until you, I'm not against the Arab or the Greek people, but when you find out that you have a colonial situation where a king has been imposed against the will of the native population, that has an effect on the way you look at the situation. And then, in fact, all this hostility or negativity evaporates. But the people who wanted that hostility, and I believe that they did, because they suffered from those issues themselves. If you read Eusebius, you'll get a dose of it. He really hates Jews. I mean, he hates Jews. He's Greek. And, he revels in the fact that they eat their children during the siege. He loves it. And he's supposed to be a person full of brotherly love and charity. The guy is totally insane in terms of the hatred that he suffered. Not even aware of it. Yeah, what is your question?
So Herod mainly was uncircumcised and did not keep
No, you're way ahead of me. Let me finish my presentation, because those kind of questions we're not at Herod yet. We're on his phone.
Yeah, the father.
So you're way ahead. So this person is the intermediary in this process, and as Pompey storms Jerusalem with the help of collaborating Jewish groups too. And if you study the history carefully, you'll see that there's two brothers, of the native Maccabean dynasty, that was a nationalist dynasty, that are fighting each other for control. The younger brother is more popular. The older brother is high priest. He is basically thrown out by his younger brother, and that high priest therefore is involved with Herod's father as one of his operatives, or someone he uses for, or is used by him for relations with this Petra place. So this Herod's father is clearly related in some way by marriage to this royal family of Petra, as well as the coastline. And so he's, in this sense, I think he's more Arab, if you want to put it that way, than anything else. By this time, I think you would start to become a lot of these people Arab, though not completely. So you're asking me circumcised. I don't know if he's circumcised. I wasn't there. I assume he would have had his son circumcised, perhaps. I didn't undress him, so I really don't have any idea. And Paul, you see, is very worked up about the issue of circumcision, so maybe that was an issue for him at the time. I have no idea. But those who wanted to be Judaized obviously would have made a pretense of circumcision, but those who had not been born that way might not have been. So we don't have records about that. But anyway, to go back to our subject. So when the Romans take over, they destroy the Maccabean family, basically, take the one in chains to Rome, as I told you. And the second thing is, the first Roman governor after the generals depart is Herod's father. And so we now have a situation of foreign control, colonial control, of unpopular government over a people that's very obstreperous and extremely zealous in certain religious matters. And this new government is not going to measure up to their standards. We get an indication of that even in the New Testament with John the Baptist, who's clearly a popular, charismatic leader. Now, he is Jewish from the countryside of some kind, out in the wilderness like the Dead Sea Scrolls people, and he loses his head in some manner in struggle with the Herodian family. It's some abstruse legal issues are put in the New Testament story, but those are not backed up in Josephus' presentation of them. As I told you before, Josephus in the Antiquities says that John was killed because Herod, and by this time all the Herods are calling themselves Herod. The reason is, like Caesar, they model themselves on Caesar, like the way Kerry's modeling himself on Kennedy. He even calls himself JFK, because the initials of his name are JFK. Herod saw Caesar as the pattern of a person who rose and made his family into kings and emperors. And after that, they were all called Caesar. So all Herods are being called Herod in Palestine ever after the family, after the family takes real control. And the family's taking real control here between the 60s and the 30s. That's when they're taking real control. So all this is just prior to the birth of Jesus, but not maybe to the birth of Jesus' parents. And certainly we don't know about Joseph, because in fact Joseph isn't even supposed to be the father from what the documents we know present. So we can zero more in on the mother. The mother has a Maccabean name, Mary or Miriam. She's the last Maccabean princess that Herod forcibly married, then executed, and then executed her children by him because he was jealous that they might supplant him. Executed her brother because he thought they were more popular than he was. So if you were named Mariam or Miriam in 30 BC, you probably were a Maccabean sympathizer. I wouldn't name myself like in the Afro-American community. A lot of people are named like Kennedy, usually named after presidents that they admired. Roosevelt, like Roosevelt Greer, Kennedy, so on. They took often names of American president. Wilson, somebody. Lincoln, somebody. Usually you don't take a leader's name for your children unless you admire that leader. So since all the early Christians have Maccabean names, you get the impression that most of them come from families sympathetic to the previous Maccabean situation. By Maccabean names, I mean Judas, Simon, Mary, Miriam, John. These are all Maccabean names of the Maccabean ruling dynasty in this in the period 160 to 60. These are all names that were being used in the Maccabean family. So if you're born in the 30s or even the 10s of the next century and you've got one of these names, I think the impression is that the family is not hostile, certainly, to the Maccabees. And you're not called Herod after all, or Antipater, or some name like that. So you're naming yourself after Maccabean heroes. So I think that's very underappreciated in terms of the situation that we're talking about. Now, so Josephus tells us that this Antipater turned this governorship into a dynasty with Roman sponsorship and agreement, and that all his heirs in perpetuity were to be Roman citizens forever after for the services they rendered to Rome. And I told you previously that I think, in my book, and I'm way ahead of myself, that's where Paul got his Roman citizenship from, because I've already assumed that Paul is a member of this very large Herodian family by the time we get into the first century. You say, how do you know? Well, I told you last time that he sends his regards in Romans to his cousin, the little Herod. That's a pretty strong, if that's accurate, indication that he has some relation with the Herods. Also, his community, as described in Acts, is composed of at least one member who was the foster brother of Herod the Tetrarch, it says in Acts. This person who was the foster brother of Herod the Tetrarch. Herod the Tetrarch is the person who killed John the Baptist. And he's supposed to be his foster brother, and he's in Paul's community in Antioch as a founding member. So there are lots of indications of just proofs that are, what do you call proof that's not sure, but circumstantial. They're not just circumstantial evidence, but it builds up into a presumption as you go along with this. In any event, to go back to where we were, we don't have Herod as king yet. So Antipater, there's a lot of Jewish unrest. And in the midst of this, that's what we're talking about, Caesar and Octavian. We're getting the assassination of Caesar in 44, and then the struggle between Mark Antony and Octavian in the 30s that ended, I think, in 31 with the Battle of Actium. But in the middle of this struggle, we get Herod, Antipater's son, very unpopular person who had been under his father governor of Galilee. Where do we get this information from? Josephus. So we have very detailed information from this person. And as governor of Galilee, he had executed what is called in Josephus didn't live at this time, he's using sources on the basis of previous sources, killed or executed bandits. You have to be careful of the word bandits, because it's a little bit like in Josephus, the Chinese communists talking about American bandits who have flown over Chinese airspace back in the days of the Cold War. So I mean, bandits is often a euphemism for freedom fighter. And apparently Herod had executed some Galilean freedom fighters or bandits. We know that they must have been more than just bandits, because one of their names was Hezekiah. And that is a Davidic king name. One of the last Davidic kings at the time of the Babylonian conquest was called Hezekiah. And it turns out that his descendants are making pretensions to be kings. his descendants are making, so this is not just a normal bandit. This is someone who's at the head of an insurgency of some kind, a guerrilla insurgency. And take my word that that's true. If you read them, you'll see that that is true. In any case, the so-called Sanhedrin, this is a new body that didn't exist before. It comes into existence around the time the Romans take over. It's a kind of representative body of so-called Jewish notables, 70 members, and 2 leadership positions, a priest and a Davidic chair, which is where the Septuagint 72 comes from, because all committees are considered to be 72. Why 72? Where did the number 72 come from, do you know? Well, because Moses was said to have taken 72 elders up on Mount Sinai with him when he got the law. And that's why Jesus sends out the 70, for instance, in the New Testament. Because there were 70 members of the Sanhedrin. Also, there were considered to be 70 nations of the earth, 70 different language groups. So in fact, the 70 plays into both the leadership idea in Palestine and the language idea, like speaking in tongues, or the nations of the world that you get in the early pictures of the Book of Acts and places like that. There's a big conflict in the early part of Jesus' ministry. Is it 12 or is it 70? We got 12 apostles and 70 disciples. Theoretically, I'm not sure we have that really, but that's the presentation of the numbers. How do the disciples differ from the apostles? Well, half the time you're looking at it, the apostles are the disciples, and vice versa. So it's almost impossible to distinguish the two often, and you seem to be getting overlaps of terminologies that are being used by different sources to describe similar things based on a slightly different ideology. That is the 70 language groups or the 12 tribes. So it's not clear always, because there's overlap. For instance, Thomas is both a disciple and an apostle. Often in episodes, I've been doing it now very carefully, in John or other Gospels, he says, and his disciples came to him. And the disciples include Peter and a lot of other people. So there's a lot of different overlap. Thaddeus is both a disciple and an apostle. There are other ones too, yeah.
But couldn't they be both?
Well, I'm not saying they can't.
Because, like, if they're a disciple of Jesus, they could be an apostle of someone.
Yeah, I'm not saying that they can't be. I'm just saying there seem to be some confusions. That's all. Anything's possible. I'm saying there's some problems there. Not you want to solve it like that, that's fine. But there are some issues about, well, is he an apostle? Is he a disciple? I mean, what's the difference between the two? Why is a different language being used? So I'm just giving you some patterns. I'm not trying to defend or attack. I'm giving some patterns. Why these came. The 70 is the Jewish. I talked about this because of the Sanhedrin. The number of the Jewish ruling body of that time. Council of Elders. Sanhedrin. And that's based on the 72. Number 72 of the people that went up on. Well, actually, it's originally based on the number of people that went down with Jacob to Egypt. Considered to be 72. And then that's the number of people that are on Mount Sinai. 72 becomes a focal number. And then the 70 language groups as well. All those converge on this idea of disciples in Christianity, and of course the 12 tribes for the 12 apostles. By the way, you don't have 12 tribes for a Gentile mission. I mean, you don't have 12 apostles for a Gentile mission. Because 12 apostles means one to each tribe in theory. Though by this time there are no more tribes as such, as I told you. I think there's only, if I didn't tell you, there's really only Judah left by this time, and Levites of the priest class. There are no others, even though claims are made about being Benjamin. There really are no Benjaminites as such left, though some people may have been making Benjaminite claims, and I'll explain that later on. But you don't hear someone making like Issacharite claims. You don't hear someone, that kind of tribe. You don't hear someone making Danite claims. You don't hear someone making like, God, I can't think of some of the other tribes, but some of those Naphtaliite claims, Manassehite claims, Ephraimite claims. Benjamin is a particular thing, and I think that Paul's the only one we know making such a claim. I think it, in time, will have to do with this Herodian problem. The reason being that you'll see there's a similar genealogy in the Bible for Benjaminites and Edomites. They have the same genealogy in the Bible, so there's some overlap there. And I think that the Idumeans, which is what the Herodians were also considered to be, Idumeans or Edomites. Idumeans over here. Or what we would call Edomites, Greek Edomites, were maybe making Benjaminite claims to legitimatize themselves when the Herodian family started coming in. But that's a very, thing. But in any case, point is you're getting constant struggle here against the background of the Roman struggle. And against the Roman struggle of these people like Octavian and so on, Herod gets a Roman army. Even though, and he had been governor, he was governor of Galilee, he was very unpopular. Sanhedrin actually had called him to account, wanting to execute him for having killed this so-called bandit chief. So the Sanhedrin didn't think it was a bandit chief. They thought he had overstepped his authority as governor. And what he did was he marched into the Sanhedrin with his soldiers and basically dismissed it. Something what Caesar or Mark Antony might have done in Rome. So by that time he was bullying people and using his... Napoleon did the same thing for the, just saw a biography of Napoleon when the Chamber of Deputies opposed him. He marched in with his soldiers and dismissed the whole Chamber of Deputies and became emperor. By that time Herod was doing the same thing. So he was not popular, he was very unpopular. And ultimately, the Persians came in while the Romans were fighting each other. They were a power further east, and for a while Persians reasserted control. It's all in Josephus and around the 40s. Therefore, Herod fled to Rome and got a Roman army with the sponsorship of Mark Antony, who had been his father's friend. He'd been his father's friend. And he got a Roman army, came back, stormed Jerusalem in 37 BC, and put himself in power with Roman soldiers. And the one party that Josephus makes it clear was not willing to resist were the Pharisees. They consistently are the peace party and recommended the people to open the gates to Herod. The people don't open the gates to Herod. So the claim that the Pharisees are the popular party is only a misnomer foisted by their later heirs. Who are the later heirs of the Pharisees? The rabbis. The rabbis of medieval and modern Judaism, Talmudic Judaism. The Talmud is really the teaching book descended from the Pharisees. So what we have today in Judaism is Pharisaic Judaism, and the New Testament in attacking that is attacking Judaism to some extent, as it's known after the death of Jesus and in the 2nd century, perhaps 1st or 2nd century, knowing that that's what Judaism has become. But there's more meaning to the Pharisees than that, as I'll tell you when we get through it. But the first indication we get of Pharisees is somewhere around the 1st century BC in these struggles. And the Pharisees consistently support foreign rule in Palestine. You said, how can that be? Why would a party? Because they're not the revolutionary party. They're not the extremist parties. They're not the messianist parties. They're not the zealot parties. There are many parties. For instance, you say that the Pharisees are condemned in the Gospels. Well, they're condemned in the Dead Sea Scrolls too. So these are extremist Jewish literature in the Dead Sea Scrolls that dislike or hate the Pharisees as much or more than the New Testament does. Yeah.
So the Pharisees are more of a political group?
Political religious. But, they're interested mostly in studying Torah. They don't want to get into politics, perhaps. Anyone will let them have their academies or their schools, fine. Just like today, in Israel, there are groups in Israel that recognize King Hussein as the king, or prefer to have Yasser Arafat. These are religious called Hasidim, who are just into, they say you can't have a Jewish state because it would, you have to wait till the Messiah comes for this Jewish state. It's going to be corrupt any Jewish state, so we'd rather have foreign rule here. And as long as they'll, give us what we want, our pensions, our schools, our, support us, we recognize them as our leaders. We don't want to recognize any Jewish leaders. And so that's a religious group, right? But it also has a political, it's a political stance. So often extreme religious people are, in fact, verge on collaborators. Sometimes they're zealots and zealots and maniacs like Bin Laden and people like that who are not, collaborators. They're the opposite. They like to cut the heads off of collaborators. People, they call everyone else collaborators. And sometimes you get, very accommodations religious groups. The Pharisees are the accommodating religious group. They're willing to live with foreign power. They're willing to live with priests appointed by foreign. This is how you define them. You have to define them. You won't find it in any book, because people haven't realized this about the Pharisees, because the most people who write the history are either Christians who are Paulinized, and their outlook is Paulinized. Paul claims to be a student of the Pharisees, so they don't really want to criticize the Pharisees except as they oppose Jesus. Or rabbinic Jewish people who have been trained in rabbinic things, who claim who think the Pharisees are heroic. Now they after them. So none of them have an objective view of the period of this history, because one or the other is promoting the people that they feel affection for. You say, well, come on, no one's objective? No, not if you represent a religious group. You're usually not objective. If you're just a secular scholar who comes at it with no interest in any religious group, you might begin, like our normal history department should be, you might begin to get objective. But in our field, biblical studies, there's very few scholars like that. Most of them have a training in a theological seminary or a rabbinic seminary. And in Islam, it'll usually be an Islamic seminary. And this is a very weird field of religious studies, let me tell you. It's very frightening if you don't know it that well. So, in any case, you rarely get Pharisees defined as seeking accommodation with foreigners, but that's in fact probably the best way. Normally you'll hear them nitpickers, but everyone was a nitpicker over the legal things. The Dead Sea Scrolls people are nitpickers over legal things, but they hate the Pharisees. So being a nitpicker over legal things is not sufficient to tell the difference between the Dead Sea Scroll. That's what I mean with the new documents. We have a treasure trove since 48 of a discovery of a contemporary literature that is not. See, the Pharisees, whatever you say, have gone through the editorial process of the Roman Empire. When the Jews surrendered to Rome in 70 AD, and the last holdouts committed suicide in 73, the Pharisees were the only party the Romans were willing to live with. Because the Pharisees were the only party who accepted Roman government in Palestine. Except for the Pauline Christians, as they developed. Because the Pauline Christians, through Paul's writings in Romans. How many have read Romans? Romans 13. The government authorities are put there by God. Therefore, if you oppose the governing authorities, you are opposing the will of God. That is the classic statement of accommodations. Anyone who bears the sword will bear the reward of bearing the sword. It will cause its own reward. The governing authorities are your friends. Therefore, you pay them what is owed to them. Pay taxes. I could read the passage, but I don't have to. You can find it. Romans 13, 1 to 13. It's the classic statement, and it's clear. Paul has put the Roman authorities, basically, he doesn't say that Rome as such, but obviously that's what he means, in the place of the authorities that would have been considered appropriate in Palestine, God, Mosaic sort of authorities. For him, God has already given judgment on behalf of the Romans. Well, this is a guy walking around with a Roman citizenship and uses it to save himself on several occasions. So, in fact, it's not surprising that's his outlook. I don't think Jesus had a Roman citizenship. Okay? And if he did, he didn't pull it out when the chips were down. So these are two different species of fish. And one does not represent what the other is, or vice versa, though that's what our documents are attempting to show us, that one, in fact, does understand the other, even better than his own followers and apostles. And I reject that absolutely. I think that's a preposterous statement. I think that that is not something historically that would stand up to scrutiny. And the only reason we accept it is for theological reasons, because we like Paul's theology, because Paul's theology created the Gentile mission, and we're all Gentiles, the products of that mission. So therefore, we like the hero who brought us into the fold on the conditions under which he brought us into this fold. But that doesn't necessarily represent what Palestine was in the first century. That's just what's in the letters of Paul, which are our basic theological documents. Paul's letters supersede everything else in terms of their control and power for our thought process. So we basically follow that. So that's what I say. So there are two groups that survived the war against Rome. One, accommodating Christians. Two, accommodating Jews. The accommodating Christians are Pauline Christians. The accommodating Jews are rabbinic Jews. But there's other groups who caused the war against Rome, more zealot messianic groups who don't accommodate to anyone, who think you shouldn't pay taxes to Rome, who think that only God rules here, and so on and so forth. So these are holdouts in various areas, and the scroll documents represent that third group. And that's why we're so fortunate, because now we have the third group, the mindset of the third group by which we can measure the other two. So you can't blame scholars before 1950 for not knowing this stuff. But after 1950, you can start to blame them, because we now have a whole literature of the third way, if you want to call it that way. The literature of the war against Rome, the mindset of the war against Rome, the literature of the native messianic movement, if you want to call it that. All kinds of things like that here, which are totally different than what we've been presented. And finally, it's clear, if you now read the letters of Paul in that context, that Paul is familiar with this group, that he spent time with this group, that he's using the vocabulary of this group, but he's turning it 180 degrees inside out. And that's a very important conclusion. Now, how can I draw that conclusion? Because I look at the documents. You haven't drawn that conclusion only because you haven't yet got the documents taken some time. Anyway, let's go back now. So we have this Herod who's very unpopular, has to go to Rome, get an army under Mark Antony, who sponsored his father, come back, storm Jerusalem, only the Pharisees cooperate. He therefore executes all members of the previous Sanhedrin that opposed him, which includes so-called Sadducees and every other group, Maccabean groups and so on. But we have Sadducees in the New Testament, right? But the Sadducees in the New Testament are not the Sadducees Herod executes before 37 BC. They're a new group that owe their existence to Herod and his family. So really, after that date, we should call these people Herodian Sadducees. But of course, they don't do that. They just call themselves Sadducees. Well, what does the word Sadducee mean? Priest class, basically. So by the time Herod has gotten rid of the Maccabean priest class, who were the priest kings previously, so I don't know if I've lost here, but the Maccabees, what party would they be? Well, Maccabean, but also they would be Sadducees. But they would be Maccabean Sadducees. When Herod destroys all them and sponsors a new group, Josephus tells us that after this period, the Sadducees were controlled in all things by the Pharisees. And that makes sense. These are the new priests, the high priests, plural, that you get pictured in the Gospels. They are high priests, plural. Why? Because there's no one high priest clan. There are different high priest clans vying for appointment by Herodian rulers and Roman governors to be the high priest for that period of time, year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever they can get themselves. But before that time, there was one high priest, the Maccabean high priest. This was a lifetime function. So you wouldn't have high priests, you would have high priest. It's only in this period you have high priests, and they would be Sadducees, but they would not be the same Sadducees as here. What does Sadducee comes from? Well, we think it comes from the word in Hebrew Zadok. So translated into Greek, that becomes Seduk. And who was Zadok? For those people who know the Bible.
There's nothing said there.
Who? Well, that's a connected term in terms of similar root letters, and there is a connection to some extent. That's the point. But well, first of all, she says Melchizedek. ZDK in Hebrew means righteousness or justice. It always means. Hebrew is a language based on three-letter roots. Melchizedek means king of righteousness. Zedek is the basic three-letter root pattern for that. And as she correctly sees, it's the same root pattern as that, only the vowels are different. This is a personal name, this is a concept. And so on. To make righteous, if you want to know in Hebrew, to make righteous, to justify, here's the three-letter root. So you put an I here, and you put a prefix, and you've got a causative, as they call it. To make someone righteous, to justify. We do it in English too, justify, and so on. But Hebrew does it with a vengeance, and so she knows, I'm sure, some Arabic, and Arabic does it with a vengeance, that they're related to. But we look for the three-letter root to know the sense of a word in Hebrew or other Semitic languages like Arabic or Aramaic or something. And the ZDK is righteousness, justice. But in this case, it's a high priest. They have a high priest. The high priest of David's time. You look in your Bible, the name of David's high priest was Zadok. And Solomon after him. The first high priest of the first temple. That's what this term is relating to. A genealogical relationship to the first high priest of the first temple. Whether they really had such a genealogy, you'll have to decide. But that's the conceit. That they're making a genealogical claim as legitimate high priests over a 1,000-year period. Whether they are or not, I don't know. So that's all that means. So you can have two different groups. One, a revolutionary Sadducee. In fact, to my mind, the Dead Sea Scrolls are what I would call messianic Sadducees. Now, these are all new terms once we get the new literature. Because the Dead Sea Scrolls are making Sadducee claims, but they're not like Herodian claims. The Dead Sea Scrolls say, we're led by sons of Zadok. Sons of Zadok. Well, sons of Zadok is a Zadokite, as we call it. To distinguish it from Sadducee is really, but it's really the same thing as Sadducee. That's just using the Hebrew. Is a Zadokite claim. We're sons of Zadok. B'nai Tzadok, as they call themselves. But as she was saying, it could also mean sons of righteousness, which is a term we also find in the New Testament. And they like wordplay like that. In fact, several times in the scrolls you've come upon the term not sons of Zadok, but sons of righteousness, sons of Zedek. And that's just dropping out one letter. You know, Hebrew is like shorthand. It doesn't have vowels like Arabic. The vowels are put in later by copyists of the 9th century. You've got to look at that thing and figure out what it means. And the copyists used to put points beneath here to tell you, that is 10 centuries later, how to pronounce this. In Arabic, they put them up here. They put the vowels and things up there. It's just consonants with an occasional vowel thrown in, which is taken as a consonant. So this would be Zedek. And actually, in the actual writing, you'll have that letter, which will mean Zadok. But that can also mean another word, Sadiq. Because we don't know when a letter is doubled. They don't show you a double letter. It comes out in Greek as double. But in Hebrew, they don't show you the doubling. You have to know that orally. So, for instance, that means righteous one, the Sadiq, the righteous one. James was called the Sadiq, James the just, James the righteous one, James the Sadiq. So how does Zadik differ from Zadok in the writing? It'd be the same. In Hebrew, the writing, because there wouldn't be any A and there wouldn't be any double D, and all you'd find here is an I, but in this one and this one are in Hebrew written as the same letter. So you wouldn't be able to tell the difference of Zadok from Zadik in the original manuscript. And in the scrolls, you can't tell the difference. I know that just confused you. But the point is that it's a very confusing language unless you know it. But it also gives itself to a lot of wordplay. So the Dead Sea Scrolls may not be really talking about genealogical descent from the Zadok of David's son. It may be talking about righteous priests. As she said, like the letter of the Hebrews first talks about a priesthood after the order of Melchizedek. But it clearly is trying to talk about righteous priests, not necessarily people descended from the pagan king Melchizedek. They're picking up the idea of righteousness. Zedek, so it's the Melchizedek priesthood is a parallel one to this one. They're both playing around with the Hebrew roots for righteousness. Do you follow me? So there's a lot of wordplay. But anyway, these resistant Zadokites are not like the cooperative Zadokites. So by the time you're getting a New Testament, and none of this is explained in the Gospels, I should be aware of, or we'd all know it wouldn't, because I don't even think the writers of the Gospels know this. You have to read all this literature and then have the new literature that's come in to appreciate what's going on here. It's very complicated. As usual, the Iraq looked simple until we went in. And now it's like a mare's nest of complexities. The same with this period. It's very complicated. So one thing is clear. The Sadducees and the Pharisees of the New Testament are government-sponsored parties. And the government are the Herodians and the Roman governors. So they owe their position to them. But you see, just to show you that they're not the popular parties, the popular parties, as usual in every time and place, are the nationalist parties. These are not the nationalist parties. They're willing to take orders from Rome, therefore they would be considered collaboration parties. And sure enough, when the revolution occurs, when the war against Rome in 66 occurs, what's the first thing they do? Burn all the high priest palaces. Well, you see, you don't have that in the New Testament. That's not in Mel Gibson's movies. What do you mean? They're Christian? They're against the high priest? No, they're Jewish. They're against the high priest. You know, to the simple-minded approach to the history here, one that is bent on portraying the situation negatively as far as the native peoples go, and only people like us being good. This is a fact. Just like Herodians not being Jewish king, that goes by the boards. So how many know that the Jews burned all the high priest palaces? And all the Herodian palaces too. Why would they do that? These are their priests? No, they weren't. They never were. They were put upon them by foreign power whom they despised. It's like saying that the American government in South Vietnamese, if they did something in South Vietnam, was the whole Vietnamese people were responsible. No, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong and all these other groups would say, we're not responsible for what those people did. They're just stooges of the Americans. They're not. They don't represent the people, and we finally overthrew them. Well, I don't know the whole situation there, I don't want to go into it. But that's a similar thing. Ultimately, in the war, which Josephus documents, the first thing, three things they do: burn all the high priest palaces, burn all the Herodian palaces, burn all the rich, and burn all the debt records. And as Josephus says, turn the poor against the rich, which is what his first-class struggle in documented history, which is why Josephus hates the revolutionaries, because he's in the rich class. And he's gone over to the Romans, and he hates them and he despises them. And he portrays them as negatively as he can, but he can't not admit their bravery, heroism, and the fact that they control things for a period of 4 years. So, going back to 37, the people don't follow the Pharisees. Do not open the gates to Herod, they resist. It was the same when Pompey came in 63. They resisted. And the Pharisees were on the other side. They were part of the connection that invited Pompey and the foreign armies into the country, as they do later on when the war against Rome begins. They invite the Roman troops to put the uprising down. So consistently from 63 BC, even before, to 37 BC, to 66 AD, the Pharisees always invite the foreign armies into the country. So they're not Jewish nationalist group. You would agree with that. And consistently, the people do not follow their approach. The only time the people ever follow the Pharisee approach is after the Romans have destroyed everything and conquered the temple and promote the Pharisees and the Pharisee patriarchs to the rulers of Palestine and their tax collectors. Then the people are forced, and have been forced in a sense ideologically ever since through the literature they produce, to follow the Pharisee approach. Only when the Romans promote them, just as later the Romans promote Pauline Christianity. They don't promote Pauline Christianity for a couple of centuries, but by the time of Eusebius and Constantine, the Romans promote one kind of Christianity and one kind only. What's that? Pauline Christianity. And that's the kind we are familiar with. So the Romans promote both Rabbinic Judaism and Pauline Christianity as two forms of religious expression that they're willing to live with. What happens to all the other ones? They get exterminated or they get pushed out in the outlying region. Some actually go down to Saudi Arabia, Arabian Peninsula, and create Islam. That's really, huh?
Excuse me. When did you say that the Romans began to promote Pauline Christianity?
Well, I don't know. It's not clear exactly how soon this managed to sort of make inroads. It was making inroads very, very early on in terms of, among the people as a whole. But when the government began to defer to it, the official is under Constantine, 300, 310, 320. That's the official takeover, both of the Roman Empire, of Christianity as the Pauline kind that we're familiar with. All the other kinds are declared heretical. And there were other kinds. There was Arianism, there were Ebionites, there were all other kinds of early groups that were considered heretical, and all their documents were burned or banned in the church councils in the 300s. And that's another whole story. But look, I'm getting way ahead of ourselves. Let's go back here. So Herod gets Roman soldiers, he storms Jerusalem, and we now have an Herodian monarchy under Herod and his descendants. They're all called Herod, and they're a huge family over time, like the Saudi family in Arabia. Herod has 10 wives, something like Muhammad. Herod has 10 wives. How do we know the Dead Sea Scrolls are anti-Herodian? Because the Dead Sea Scrolls say you shall not multiply wives unto yourself. So they obviously have someone in mind when they're saying that, and they say one wife and one wife only during the life of the ruler. 2 by 2 they went into the ark. That's picked up in the Gospels. All that is in the Dead Sea Scrolls originally. The Dead Sea Scrolls condemn niece marriage. Rabbinic Judaism doesn't. The Herodians, like Arabs generally, married their nieces. And that was banned by the Dead Sea Scrolls clearly as an attack on the Herodian family. They banned divorce. Now, when John the Baptist loses his life, he is dealing with people who were, 1, divorcing, and 2, both involved in marrying their uncles. Because Herodias were married not on one uncle, but 2 uncles. So John has lots of things in the Dead Sea Scrolls to complain about there, and I think those are really the parameters of his complaints and what he's executing on. But in any case, the Herodians take over 37 BC, and by the time the New Testament then is presenting us the history, Jesus is born around the time of the death of Herod, 4 BC. So he's born just when we would think he should be born, when the idea of who's going to be king here is called into question. I really got way beyond myself there. What we'll do next time is, we will start with this book, and I really think we're at a point now that we can start with this book, and we can just pick up. This is a book, as I told you, that was written by the person who helped bring about the takeover of Christianity in the Roman Empire. Eusebius was the bishop of Constantine, who made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire in the early 300s, 310, 320 period, and they called the first church council of Nicaea in 325, which Eusebius, the man who wrote this book, organized. So his ideas will be the official ideas of Christianity as they take over the Roman Empire, and some of them are quite frightening, actually. When you read this, your hair can sometimes stand up in your head. That's fine. That's great. Thanks a lot. See you next time. That was way too much for you guys to get. I don't hold you responsible for any of that material. Except insofar as you feel like bringing it into an essay. My essays will be more directed to what's in this book. But that gets us all on an equal footing. We know we're all on the same stage.